Evening, everybody, and Elizabeth, thank you for those kind words. Um, I'm a very lucky human being in that I have worked in the Okavango Delta in northwest Botswana for the last 40 years. But I've actually worked in wildlife since the early 1970s, when I became a game ranger in Zimbabwe. In those days, of course, it was called Rhodesia. And people often, and it's a very common question actually, as I get a little older, I'm not an old man yet, but as I get a little older, people often ask me, how did I um, get into wildlife as a career, and why am I so crazy about rhinoceros and wildlife in general? Of course, the first thing is that I was very lucky to have been born in Africa and grown up my entire life in Botswana. I grew up in a town called Francistown, which is actually in the eastern part of Botswana, and was a pretty wild place in itself in the 1960s. My father was an engineer who came out with the British Colonial Service to improve the lives of the people in these remote countries. Botswana, for example, had no electricity at all in the late 1940s when he came out. And so he built a power station in Francistown and supplied power. He then built or drilled wells and supplied running water, followed by running sewage, followed by roads. So he spent his entire life looking after and improving the lives of people. He lived in a very small community. The town of Francistown probably only had about 5,000 people at that time. And to make their lives a little bit better, what he did is he imported a 16mm film projector and built a wall at the local community club and would show the people 16mm films on a Saturday evening. You had to take your own chair and your own cooler, and you'd sit there and watch the movie that my father provided. Now, as was a tradition in the British colonies anyway, you always watched a short movie or a newsreel followed by an interval and then the main feature. And I remember very, very clearly watching a short newsreel that my father put up on the screen. It would have been about 1965, because the newsreel was made by British Pathé through their distribution agents Movietone News in the United Kingdom. And this documentary that he featured that evening showed a bunch of heroes, as far as I am concerned, who were working in the Zambezi Valley when the man-made Lake Kariba first started filling. It's a man-made dam across the Zambezi River. Kariba was built in 1960 and started to fill. And by 1963-64, the valley was getting very, very full. And so animals were being trapped on ever decreasing islands and were in danger of being drowned. And so a young man called Rupert Fothergill was ordered by the Department of Wildlife and National Parks to go out and rescue as many of the animals as he could and take them to high ground. And he did this with virtually no resources, small little boats, just lots and lots of men using ropes and nets. He'd catch anything from dangerous snakes, he'd herd elephants, he'd catch rodents, and of course, rhinoceros. And he'd rescue them and take them to high ground. And having watched that movie, right there and then, I wanted to be Rupert Fothergill. I wanted to be a game ranger, and little was I to know that he was rescuing animals from rising water, and I would land up half a century later moving animals because of poaching. So in a way, he was rescuing them from water and I was rescuing them from blood. But I've actually been very lucky in that a journalist friend of mine searched through the archives in London and actually found that black and white footage of Rupert Fothergill rescuing a black rhino. Remember that this is 1964, it is black and white, the sound is rather erratic, But Elizabeth has the video there, so she will put it on, and it'll give you some idea of what can go off in a young man's head and set off a career in conservation.
So I'm going to put the video on now. So let's see if everyone can see the screen. Can everyone see it?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, great. Here we go.
Man-made lake, 200 miles long, 40 miles at its widest part. A female rhinoceros caught by the rising waters tried to escape her pursuers, not realizing they were rescuers. The rhino was one of many thousand animals flooded out by the rising waters of the lake. All kinds of animals, even elephants. The one-ton bad-tempered lady was shot down, not by an ordinary bullet, but by one made of an anesthetic. Water cooled a place for the injection of a tranquilizer, and when it comes to subduing a pet of this size, they have to use a considerable shock. They learned that much from a previous attempt at rhino rescue. That time the animal got away, which it may regret before the lake completely fills up. Having improvised a sort of land raft, they faced the difficulty of getting the little girl to lie on it for transportation elsewhere. They call this animal rescue business, which has been going on since the lake began filling, Operation Noah. Rupert Fothergill, in charge of it, told his boys to try again. This time they nearly succeeded. And still, the rhino didn't understand it was all for her own good. That if she didn't take it lying down and managed to escape, she'd come to a watery end. Whereas if she took it quietly, they'd get her to the mainland, out of harm's way, and free to live a natural life. Only no one knew how to convince her of that simple truth. Ideally, what this sort of operation needs is an animal hypnotizer. At the water's edge, it was a comparatively lively job to transfer Miss Rhino onto a floating raft. After that, the going was more comfortall all round. The animal didn't seem to be suffering from more than a shock to her dignity, though of course members of her sex often take that seriously. Making for ground that will always be above the watermark, they found a landing place. Miss Rhino's release was only a matter of minutes. Fothergill warned his crew to get well out of the way when the time came, just in case that tranquilizer wasn't up to its work, and Miss Rhino showed typical feminine vindictiveness. For a few seconds, she was stiff and dazed. But then, the old fighting spirit asserted itself, and safety first was the cry all round. So she charged the boat and put a few holes in that. Fothergill tried to persuade her that there were better targets ashore. From her old quarters, she'd been as reluctant to be evicted as a St. Pancras tenant. Now, a new life lay ahead as soon as she could get the places out of it and away from those interfering human beings.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Okay, let me, sorry, I am trying to, I can't stop the sharing for some reason. Here we go. Okay, back to.
Okay, thank you very much for that. But I thought I'd put that on at the beginning to as a bit of fun, and something that I remember very, very well as igniting a fire in a young boy's mind. Of course, many, many years later, I've gone on to work with rhinoceros professionally, and I founded the Rhino Conservation Botswana Trust, which is an NGO, non-profit, completely dependent on funding. I thought this afternoon to just give you a slideshow, and Elizabeth will control it for me from her end, and give you some idea of the state of rhinoceros in the world. Before she does that, I just want you to understand that the damage that has been done to rhinoceros worldwide has happened pretty much in the last 120, 130 years. These are animals that in the fossil record go back beyond 50 million years in various forms or other. But as recent, and it's an absolute blink of an eyelid, 150 years, the last 150 years, the populations of animals have probably shrunk from close to 800,000 to 1 million black rhinoceros in Africa, and probably 300,000 white rhinoceros in Southern Africa, down to the few we have today. And even worse for me to contemplate is that since that film you just saw in 1964 or 65, whenever it was, I was about 10 years old, since that time, the black rhino population has dropped from 70,000 to only about 4,000. In fact, it got as low as 2,000, and conservation has brought it back a little. So in my lifetime, a severe amount of damage has been done to just rhinoceros, never mind many, many other species. But there are some very, very good people out there fighting as hard as they can, with very few resources and scratching around for funds to keep it together. So I thought I'd quickly give you a rundown on where we are in the world. So put up the first slide, please.
Okay, hold on. I now have to, here we go, share PowerPoint. Here we go.
Okay, I put that up there. Most of you, and the reason I put this up is because sometimes there are youngsters, children that need to know where Botswana is. But you can see that it's in southern Africa there, surrounded by South Africa to the south, Namibia to the west, Angola and Zambia to the northwest and west, and then Zimbabwe to the northeast. So Botswana is landlocked completely, and it is best described as an arid savanna, although the biomes run from pure desert in the southwest, the extreme southwest, to a rainfall regime of close to 700 millimeters in the northeast. Largely, it is arid savanna on what we call Kalahari or Kalahari sands. So the name Kalahari actually comes after a type of sand which has been deposited in the south central part of Africa over the course of 58 million years. It is very deep sand, up to places 300 meters deep. I think in American terms, it's about 1,000 feet. And this is extremely porous, well-drained aeolian or wind-blown sands. But it is able to support a wide variety of shrubs and grasses, and is actually a rich environment. The Republic of Botswana has about 2.5 million people, which is, as you can imagine, very low, and which allows the country to have over 30% of its land under wildlife. That wildlife is living in different types of parks, from the classic Central Kalahari Game Reserve, right down in the southwest is the Kalahari Transfrontier Park, the Chobe National Park up near the Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia axis, and then of course the Okavango Delta in the northwest. So the next slide features Botswana and the Okavango Delta. I have been extremely fortunate to live in the Okavango Delta, or on the edge of the Okavango Delta right now, but in the Okavango Delta since the early 1980s, so close to 40 years. It is an absolutely, those who've been there will understand what I'm talking about, but it is absolutely unique and very, very pristine. It has its origins as two rivers in Angola to the northwest, and they receive their rainfall, as does the Okavango fan itself. And I refer to it as a fan because it is an alluvial fan. It's only named a delta because of its shape. And it is confined within fault lines that are an extension of the East African Rift Valley, which runs down from Zambia and under the Kalahari Sands in Botswana. But the rainfall over the entire catchment, which is there in pale blue, and of course surrounding that, falls between November and April. That is in the Southern Hemisphere summer. And the average rainfall over the delta itself, where the word Okavango is about 500 to 550 millimeters of rain per year. That's about 20 inches. But up in the catchment, that can be as high as 800 to 900 millimeters. And that varies enormously. I have lived there all these years, and I've never seen 2 years the same. Because what happens is when it actually rains, this entire area around the Okavango and into the Kalahari gets very lush and green, and there's water lying in pans on the surface. But evaporation very quickly removes that water. The evaporation exceeds rainfall by a factor of 5. But then what happens is the water that has fallen in Angola in November, December, and January flows down those two rivers, joins to become a single river, and flows across Namibia into Botswana in about January or February of the following year, and then spills out into this great alluvial fan and fills the Okavango Delta to capacity in about July or August each year. And has created a mosaic of islands, floodplains, and forests that, as I say, are very, very pristine. The inventory, the biodiversity inventory of the Okavango Delta is almost entirely intact, except, of course, for man-made damage, which is what happened to the rhinoceros. They used to occur here in large numbers, both white and black rhinoceros, until probably about the 1960s, 1970s, and into the early 1980s in the case of the area surrounding the Okavango. And by the mid-1980s, the rhinoceros has been shot to local extinction in Botswana. And so this biodiversity inventory I talk about had been reduced by the 2 species of rhino. To give you some background, put up the next slide, please, Elizabeth. That's an aerial view of some Cape buffalo running through a flooded grassland, or what we call a malapo, floodplain of the Okavango Delta during the peak of the flood. And these grasses emerge through the water as the water arrives from Angola and spills out into shallow floodplains. You can see by the length of those animals' legs that water is no more than about 1 foot to 18 inches deep. And that water will eventually recede under the onslaught of evaporation and the reduced input from Angola. But these grasslands can support grazers at a very high level. It's very lush. But importantly, in the background, you will see an island there with both shrubs and tall forest trees. And you can imagine the range of diversity, particularly with mammals and birds, never mind insects, amphibians, reptiles, funguses, and so on, that you can keep here. But in the case of rhinoceros, the white rhinoceros live in the grassland, the black rhinos in that bush there, and I'll explain more about that. Can you put up the next slide, please? Okay, I will deal with the African rhinos very shortly, but it's important to point out that there are 3 remaining other species of rhinos in the world. You will see there the greater one-horned rhino, or what some people call the Indian rhinoceros. There's a little over 3 1/3,000 Indian rhinos, and they are a success story, actually. They once upon a time numbered probably 300,000 to 400,000 and were poached to less than 1,000. And the Indian government is to be congratulated for the work it's done with communities, and through a range expansion program where they moved rhinos from one reserve to another to give them the best opportunity. And they continue to be on the increase. They have lost some during the course of 2018 and 2019, but the numbers born still outstrip those that were poached. Unfortunately, I have to report to you that both the Sumatran and Javan rhinos of Indonesia continue to slide. The Sumatran rhino is definitely less than 100. It's actually estimated there's as little as 50 to 60 left, and the Javan rhino is now less than 30. These animals are in very real trouble, mostly because of their habitat is thick tropical forest, or what some people used to casually call a jungle. And a lot of that, other than poaching, which they of course are suffering from, a lot of the forest is being removed for plantations, particularly palm oil. And so, not only the orangutan and other great apes and birds are in trouble, but so are those 2 species of rhinos. Now I'd like to turn to the black and the white rhino. You can see there that...
Next slide.
No, leave it there for the moment. This will do. Okay, we have 2 species of rhinos left in Africa, although there were always only the 2 species in Africa. The black rhino is divided into 3 or 4 subspecies, but I will lump them together as a single species. As you look at them, the black rhino is the fellow there with a pointed lip on your left, and it's a relatively small rhino compared to the white rhino, but still will weigh about 1,450 kilograms I'd need to put that in pounds, but that's about 3,000, 3,500 pounds. And it is a browser. That little pointed lip allows it to reach up and pull small branches down and remove the leaves and even small twigs, probably up to the thickness of my little finger. He's a feisty little bugger. He has a short temper, very poor eyesight, but beautifully developed hearing and a great sense of smell. And he will use that hearing to track you down if you are making the slightest noise. And when he gets within 20 yards, he'll see you clearly and he'll bloody well chase you. I've spent many minutes up a tree with one of those behind me because our job really is to locate them and account for them and monitor them as often as we can. The white rhinoceros on your right-hand side there is a grazer. It lives out in the open, eating that beautiful green grass you saw earlier with the Cape buffalo. It has a wide, flat lip, and you can see that is quite clearly a lawnmower. It eats grass and mows it down to actually quite an even shortness, which resembles a lawn. It is a very heavy animal. This will go well over 2,000 kilograms, which is written there. I've seen them at about 2,400, 2,500. And it's a bit more lumbering than the black rhinoceros. However, don't underestimate, he can still get up to 30, 35 kilometers an hour if he accelerates very, very fast. But he's not easy to anger. You have to threaten him quite severely or it quite severely. Very powerful neck to support that heavy head. In this case, the two horns you're looking at, which is what they are poached for, by the way, the black rhino horn in this picture will be probably 4 kilograms, and the white rhino horn, the one in the front, of course, the back one's equally valuable, but the one in the front is probably about 7 kilograms. So you can see the current price, or before I left Botswana, which is now about 6 weeks ago, the price of rhino horn in Africa was at about $8,000 to $9,000 a kilogram. I believe that if you can get the horn intact to China, they'll pay you up to $38,000 a kilogram. So these animals are being killed and always have been killed for this horn, which has been prized in various cultures around the world for several thousand years. They used to use them in the Middle East to make dagger handles in the Yemen and the Saudi republics. They have a ceremonial dagger they wear there called a jambia. And they still take a certain amount of them for an undercover business. But the Grand Mullah in Yemen declared that it was not religious to wear those daggers with rhino horn handles a few years ago. And that dried up a market. But currently the main market is in Southeast Asia, particularly centered on Vietnam, which is a serious offender, Laos, Thailand, Taiwan, and China itself. So the market continues to thrive over there, and they use it in Southeast Asia as various types of medicine. There is a traditional Chinese medicine manual or book or whatever you'd like to call it. That's 1,000 or 2,000 years old, and it has over 700 recipes for curing various ailments that include rhino horn as part of the recipe. Remember that rhino horn is usually mixed with other stuff if you're going to cure a hangover or gout or cancer. But more recently, we're finding that very wealthy people in Southeast Asia are sourcing rhino horn as a status symbol, to show that they have made it in the world of commerce. You might say it's the Asian Ferrari, for want of a better way to put it. And these animals, the black rhinoceros, I'll tell you an interesting history while we're on storytelling. The white rhinoceros was pretty much restricted to southern Africa throughout history, and probably numbered 300,000 at the peak of its population about 2 centuries ago, maybe 150 years ago. And when the trade routes around the Cape of Good Hope to the Far East and the Middle East were opened up with sailing ships followed by steam-powered ships, and the people realized there was a market for rhino horn, hunters and traders moved inland into Africa and shot these rhinos and started to trade their horns. And by 1910, which is about 110 years ago, the white rhinoceros that you see on the right there was reduced to less than 100 animals in the world. Now, I mean, that's a slaughter as it is. But the reason for that is that the white rhinoceros comes out into the open to eat grass and is a lot easier to find than the black rhinoceros in the thicket. And as I told you, the black rhino is also a formidable opponent, so the white rhino is easier to find. And the white rhino is a success story because some South African guys in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa realized that there was trouble for these rhinos and put them under protection in what is today the Mfolozi complex under armed guard, and they started breeding them. And they pioneered the protection of rhinos in Africa. And from that population, later on in the same century, in about 1960, Dr. Ian Player, a great doyen of rhino conservationists, started what is now referred to as a range expansion program, where he realized that if you keep rhinos in a fixed size park, and they breed very well, and they can breed up to 8% per year, when they come into balance with the amount of food and water available to them, they start to overcome or overpower the ecosystem, and so breeding rates drop. And so what he did is he started to capture and move selected females and a few bulls to suitable habitat elsewhere, thereby returning the original population to high breeding rates and the new population to high breeding rates. And so he maximized the breeding of white rhinoceros. And so he managed to breed them from less than 100 in 1960 to about 22,000 by 2010. So that's a success story. Unfortunately, that has largely been undone by a poaching onslaught which started in 2008 and continues today. South Africa is losing close to 1,000 rhinoceros each year. And so the gains of the last 20 years have been set back. So the current rate of white rhino loss is greater than the birth rate. Now, we'll switch to the black rhino and a similar tale. I just told you that the white rhino had been reduced to less than 100 animals by 1910. In that same year, the black rhinoceros still numbered in excess of 150,000. It was much more widely distributed in Africa. I'm not sure, Elizabeth, if there's further slides. It may feature the distribution of... no, it doesn't. Okay, just stay there for a moment. The black rhino was much more widespread in Africa, in fact, wherever there was savanna. So right up through East Africa, stretching around through the Sudan, Central African Republic, even as far away as Cameroon. And there's records of them being in Morocco. But once the white rhino had been reduced to less than 100 and were put under protection, the illegal hunters, what we now refer to as poachers, turned their attention to black rhinoceros. And the 150,000 black rhinoceros in the year 1910 were reduced to probably about 70,000 by 1960. And by 2000 had been reduced to less than 2,000. So this is a species genocide, really, for want of a better way to put it. And the black rhino has recovered ever so slightly to about 4,000, 4,500 animals. But in the current poaching crisis, we are losing a large percentage of black rhinoceros. So the black rhino is listed by the IUCN as critically endangered. The white rhino is vulnerable. Now, critically endangered, ladies and gentlemen, is only one step from extinction. The black rhino, if it continues to be hunted as it is in 2019 and 2020, could easily go extinct by 2025, 2026, because the current rate is too high and is much higher than the birth rate. Can we go to the next slide?
Yes. Sorry. Yep.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Botswana Rhino Project. which was started in the year 2000 by the safari company Wilderness Safaris. I'm sure a lot of you know them. Many of you may have traveled with them. I worked with Wilderness Safaris and was invited to do so by Keith Vincent to help him with his environmental platform. And part of that was the reintroduction of rhinoceros. And we started with white rhinoceros in the year 2000. And slowly but surely, as we could raise funds and source the money to find rhinoceros, we started to move white rhinoceros into Botswana. This was followed many, many years later by black rhinoceros. It took me at least 9 years to convince people to part with black rhinoceros. There are so few of them left. And we managed eventually to source 38 black rhinoceros. So between the year 2000 and 2016, various projects in Botswana brought 138 rhinoceros to Botswana, both black and white. And to do that, next slide, we had to go to South Africa and capture the white rhinos. Now, you saw earlier what Rupert Fothergill did with the guys, lots of people and ropes and very crude drugs. And since that time, I'm pleased to tell you that the experimentation and evolution of drugs has moved very fast. And so we dart the rhinos with stuff called etofin hydrochloride, which is fitted into a dart and fired through a rifle that is powered by compressed carbon dioxide, CO2. And you fly this helicopter low over a rhino and fire the dart intramuscular into the rump or the shoulder. And it will take up to 10 or 12 minutes, depending on the weight of the rhino and the dose of the drug, for that rhino to start slowly to go to sleep. It doesn't instantly collapse. We don't want it to injure itself, but it goes to sleep. And then once it's down, we land the helicopter and the ground teams move in with a truck and a big crate. And we partially wake that animal up. It's about 50% awake. We have to blindfold it because its eyes are wide open, and if it sees you, it'll try and kill you. So we blindfold it and put earmuffs in its ears, and then we lead it with a rope into a crate and load it into a crate. And I'll make it sound very simple, but believe me, it is very hard and extremely dangerous work. There's been a lot of injuries. I've had my right leg smashed by a black rhino during these operations. So it is dangerous. And the helicopter flying, I think these guys are complete lunatics, but nonetheless, they fly very low so that you can get that dart in accurately. And then the animals are flown with a military aircraft. Can I have the next slide, please? Okay, there are a bunch of guys. You can see the animal well blindfolded, and it has its lead rope on and earmuffs. We've marked the ear for transport, and that is because this animal is listed by the International Agreements on Endangered Species under CITES as Appendix 1. And so to move between countries requires international agreement and international permitting. That animal is microchipped and fitted with a transmitter and is accompanied every inch of the way by a veterinarian. So you can see the veterinarian standing there next to the guys as they lead this large black rhino towards a crate. Next picture, please. And that is a typical black rhino crate designed by myself and put together by a bunch of engineers. It is made of steel and is very, very strong. That door that the guy is sitting above, it slides up and down and is lifted by a crate. The door is very, very heavy, obviously. And you can open the top of the crate and the sides so that you can have access to the rhinoceros and administer doses of drugs as you need to, because we've got to keep that animal standing. We don't like it lying down because it puts a lot of pressure on the heart and lungs. It's very heavy. So we try and keep it standing for the duration of the journey. And the whole loading process and the flights, etc., can mean up to 6 hours of immobilization or the animal under anesthetic. It is a very, very delicate operation. This thing is one of the most precious patients on earth. There are used to be tens of thousands of human anesthetic being carried out every day worldwide. and only one rhino maybe on any given day. So there are far less rhinos than humans, a very, very precious animal. So once it's loaded in that crate, next slide please, we put it into an aircraft which is very kindly loaned to the project by the Botswana Defence Force. This is an aircraft made in the United States. It is a Lockheed Hercules C-130. It's a troop transporter. It's a vehicle transporter, but we put 4 rhinoceros into that thing. And this short pilot, he's only about 5'8". His name is Major, or now he's a colonel, I think, Joseph Matwari. He's my hero because he lands that thing on that dirt airstrip, which is only about 800 yards long. You know, I've been in there a few times, and it is a hair-raising experience. You get what I call white knuckle disease, holding on to the seats as you land. But he has successfully landed that thing dozens of times for us and offloaded rhinoceros into a reserve in Botswana. Next, please. Okay, when they arrive in Botswana, they are placed in pens. That is myself talking to a young white rhino who's in a pen with his mother. And interestingly, this is a completely wild rhinoceros. And the reason we put them in the pens is that we want to habituate them to the local vegetation. It's a little known fact amongst many people that animals don't always adapt from the vegetation where they came from to the vegetation. You know, the nutrient levels, the various trace elements in the leaf is very different from one place to another, and they can get upset stomachs, and in some cases even reject the local vegetation. So I put them in these pens and then feed them a menu from different trees in the local area and see how well they're doing. The other thing that I require them to do is drink a lot of water and get urinating so that they can flush as much of the drugs out of their system as possible. Once they're eating and drinking successfully, which is maybe 10 days to 2 weeks, I open the gates and let them go in the wild. But before I do that, we fit as many of them as we can and as many as I can afford with transmitters, because the Okavango Delta is about 15,000 square kilometers. And it's, as you saw, filled with floodplains and thickets. And these animals disperse and can be very difficult to find. So we fit them with a transmitter because their movement in the first year after release is very erratic and can be over long distances. In some cases, I may have to recover them and bring them back. In other cases, if they're moving into a dangerous area where there's known poachers, I may have to put patrols into that area. So we fit them with a transmitter, in some cases fitted into the horn, in other cases as anklets. The anklets cost a little less money, so these days that's what I'm using. They are less satisfactory than the horn implants, which I think I've got a slide of. Yeah, that's Andre Ace, a friend of mine. He's a veterinarian. He's drilling into the rhino horn, and he's making a cavity into which we will fit a transmitter. And we'll fit the transmitter's antenna into the length of the horn. All of that white stuff lying around there is horn that has been removed from that cavity. It is extremely hard. It is as hard as an old pole, an old wooden pole. You know, drilling into it takes quite a few minutes. So you've only got 20 minutes with that animal anesthetized like that to fit the transmitter. Next slide. There you go. That's sideways on, the transmitter in its cavity, and the antenna is up the length of that horn. We fill that cavity with gentle acrylic, and that sets hard, rock hard. And then, of course, the horn grows over it. Remember that a rhino horn continues to grow throughout its life and is constantly worn down at the thin end by rubbing on trees or stones. And so what actually happens is that transmitter grows ever further up the horn until it gets too thin to hold the transmitter and it falls out. And that can take up to 2 years, 2.5 years. The battery in the transmitter will last as long as the number of transmissions you ask. In this case, the transmitter is a GPS transmitter. It sends a signal once a day via a satellite. It sends me a GPS coordinate, which tells me where the rhino is at a given time, and in this case, mostly at about midnight. I could get more signals out of it, but then the battery goes flat quicker. So with one signal a day, I get about 2 years to 2.5 years out of a battery. By then, the animal usually has settled down, and I don't need to refit the transmitters, unless it's a habitual wanderer, which you often get in the case of young boys. I guess much like human young boys, they wander around a lot. They also pushed around by the big bulls, and so they're looking for territories of their own. So I sometimes fit young bulls with transmitters on a regular basis because they're a danger to themselves. They like to walk around the periphery of the Okavango and often come into contact with people. So to follow these transmitters, Rhino Conservation Botswana has set up teams of guys. Next slide, please. This is a very powerful 4x4 vehicle. It's a Toyota Land Cruiser, and it is equipped to go off-road. Those are bigger tires. You can see all the rails. And these teams of guys that go along are employed. They are trackers, and they are expert trackers. The guy in the back with a rather wide smile, and you choose which one I'm talking about, is actually an expert cat tracker. He can track lions and leopards like you wouldn't believe. But he's now working with us, tracking rhinoceros. And they are equipped with a GPS recording device, a camera, binoculars, and of course the necessary papers that go with. They have all their camping gear in the back there, tents, food, refrigerators. You can see the shovels, and etc. And these guys will go into the field, and they operate out of one of our forward patrol bases that we have in the Okavango Delta, and they'll spend up to 3 months at a time out there. We supply them in the field with food and diesel, and that is what I spend a lot of money or a lot of time raising money for, is to keep these guys supplied all the time. And I have 6 of these teams out. They are assisted because the Okavango is a wetland that floods and recedes each year. They're assisted by a light aircraft that I purchased about 2 years ago. Next slide, please. This is the Alpha 2 Romeo Charlie Bravo Rhino Conservation Botswana aircraft. It is a 2-seater, one behind the other, flown by that rather good-looking young man, Mark, and he has an observer who sits behind him. This aircraft is capable of extremely slow flight. It is stretched fabric over an aluminum frame, and we have fitted it with a special kit. It can fly as low as 40 miles an hour, so that the observer can actually open the back window and take photographs of the rhinos for identification purposes. It has also helped us on a number of occasions locate poaching camps and other poaching incidents involving meat poachers or people who have poached elephants. So that aircraft is invaluable. I would love one day to be able to purchase another and put it up, because the Okavango is very, very big. This aircraft can't very, very fast, so it can't cover a lot of ground. It can fly for a long time because it doesn't use much fuel, but it can't fly very fast. So, but it is a very, very valuable. I knew it would be when I purchased it, but not. I'd underestimated just quite how valuable it would be. It does incredibly valuable work for us. Next slide, please. Okay, now Botswana. I told you we took 138 animals there, and these animals bred very well, extremely high rates. I'm pleased to tell you that the white rhino we took there, we managed to achieve 8.5% per year for the first 15 years they were there. But a couple of years ago, we came under a poaching attack, and it was only a matter of time. They've been attacking South Africa and Zimbabwe and Namibia, and they started to poach in Botswana about 2 years ago. So security is provided by the Botswana Defence Force and the Botswana Anti-Poaching Unit. You can see these rather well-equipped and well-armed men patrolling with one of my chaps who's up front there into the islands of the Okavango. This, ladies and gentlemen, is dangerous work. You know, in that bush in the front there could easily be elephant or lion or buffalo or something dangerous. However, the guys are well armed, and they haven't yet had to shoot anything. They fired warning shots in the past. My guys are so good at their job that they'll often pick up sound birds will go make a noise or give an alarm call, or insects will go quiet. And so they realize there's danger up ahead. But there could be poachers in there as well. And there have been a number of firefights in the last year between the Botswana anti-poaching forces and the poachers. And we have lost quite a number of rhinoceros in the last 2 years. In fact, we've lost an alarming number. I'm not at liberty to let these numbers out, but the poaching continues, which is why I'm in the United States and managed to get stuck in South Carolina, because I was here on a fundraising mission on a tour across the States that was to be 7 weeks, and I was only a week in. In fact, I was in the great state of Florida when people started to call me and say, look, we've got to cancel our appointment, we've got to cancel our meeting, we've got to cancel your presentation. And so I missed the last aircraft out. I will be back to complete my my tour, because to keep this organization going costs a great deal of money every year. And it's going to be very, very tight under the current conditions, because the simple fact is that a lot of funding came via the means of tourist people hearing about it in the camps. I get a lot of support from the tourist operators. You know, if I need diesel or I break a tire or my car breaks down out there, the guys will get into the nearest tourist camp and get help. They all help me. Wilderness Safaris, Great Plains and beyond, Kondo Safaris, Kerr and Downey are huge supporters. I get a lot of support from Abercrombie and Kent. And so they'll even let our guys have a shower, provide them with a hot meal. You know, when you've been out in the field for weeks on end in the dust and the grime and the danger, it's I cannot tell you how wonderful a warm and hot shower is and a good meal. So we get a lot of support from tourism. And since the aliens landed, tourism has dried up to Africa. And that support has pretty much been not available because the camps are closed. However, I'm pleased to tell you that the Botswana Defence Force has increased the number of men on the ground to a very high level during the shutdown, because we had a fear that poaching might increase. And in fact, the number of rhinos being lost during the shutdown has gone down ever so slightly from before the coronavirus. So that I put down to the efforts of the Botswana anti-poaching forces and the Botswana Defence Force. I think their presence on the ground is making a difference, as is the presence of rhino conservation personnel. So I think my time's just about up here. If you'll put up the next slide, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for listening to me. And that is what people like me live for. That is a black rhino calf, born in August 2015. He's now as big as his mother. He's 4 years old or 5 years old. And, you know, every calf born is for me a major celebration. You know, we have 7.5 billion people and only 4,000 of these left on Earth. And I have dedicated my life since I saw that movie by, made by the Pathé about Rupert Fothergill. I just made a choice to live a life with some purpose, and to try and make the world a better place for the children who are to follow, and for those of you who like to travel to Africa. And so I thank you all for listening to me. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Thank you all for listening to me. And there's a lovely quote from my friend Jane Goodall that pretty much is a slogan for the way I like to live. And I think everybody should take that into account. If you can, go to Africa, have a look. Every cent that you take there with you and spend on your holiday will make a big difference. And Elizabeth, Marcia, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to everybody.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, I'll take some questions. I'm happy to take questions if you'll unmute the populace.
So I think everyone, let's see, I think people can unmute themselves. Feel free to questions. I also put the link of Rhino Conservation Botswana on the side, so if you can go forward and, feel free to donate direct or through us as well, and we're matching it with travel credit. So
yeah, there is a website, by the way, www.rhinoconservationbotswana.com. So just go and have a look there. You'll see my ugly mug and a few other people there. And there's some information there.
So does anyone have any questions, or?
Yes, I do.
Debbie.
So I remember, and I can't remember what it was, but I remember watching something or hearing something about one of the last rhinos dying a couple years ago. What kind was that? And do you know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about, Debbie, and I like the photographs behind you, by the way.
Thank you.
What you are talking about is a northern white rhinoceros. Now, the white rhinoceros, as I said, the ones we work with are called southern whites, but there was a population of white rhinoceros in the
Oops, I can't hear you.
Okay, there's too many of us unmuted, I think.
Yeah. So maybe if everyone can mute themselves in the bottom left-hand corner and just let the people who are.
Great. I think now we're good. Map, are you there? Can you
hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, Debbie, as I said, nice photos. The animal you're talking about is a northern white rhinoceros. To give you some context, the animals we deal with in Botswana are southern whites, and they occurred in South Africa, Botswana, southern Namibia, and southern Zimbabwe originally. There was another population of northern white rhinoceros, which is a subspecies, which occurred in northern Tanzania, Kenya, and through to South Sudan. And those animals were pretty much shot to extinction in the wild, but also by the mid-1980s. But a population of about 5 animals, I think, continued to exist in a zoo in the Czech Republic. And they were moved from the Czech Republic to the Rhino Conservation in Kenya, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And one of those was a big male they called Sudan. And he had, I think, his sister and her daughter. The other 2 died very early on, so there were 3 remaining. And they have always been of concern to us because Sudan, although he attempted to mate both those ladies who were with him, he failed to impregnate them. In fact, he failed to even be able to penetrate, because it turns out that, having lived in a zoo with concrete floors, that his ankles were unable to support him correctly for the sex act to be completed. Nonetheless, before he died, they have collected sperm from him. And it has obviously been cryonated, as we call it, or kept in liquid nitrogen. And they've attempted to artificially inseminate part of that semen into the ladies, and that has failed. The latest initiative, I think the University of Virginia, I'm open to correction on that, but it's an American university using experts on horse fertilization, are attempting to carry out in vitro by harvesting an egg from those ladies and using Sudan sperm. The count of his sperm is very low, by the way. It's very, I wouldn't say non-viable, but very low viability. But if they can achieve a fertilization between the 2, they want to implant into a southern white rhinoceros surrogate. This is the theory. And the experts doing this have achieved this in horses. And of course, I don't know how much you know about rhinoceros, but the anatomy of rhinoceros is very similar to the equids, to the horses, including the digestive tract and the breathing tract. So that is why the people doing it are experts in horse breeding. And it's costing a great deal of money. I know some years ago they had a crowdfunding page to raise the money towards this initiative. I'm not sure if it's still running. It's high risk, and there is huge debate as to whether it's necessary really to be looking at bringing back a a single birth calf because you'll have to keep doing it to get viable populations. And the genetics are going to be so narrow. There are others like myself who believe that we should just mix the two, southern and northern white rhino, and just breed them up to viable levels in East Africa. Good question, Debbie, and thank you very much.
So I don't know if you can see the questions on the right, or I'm happy to read them. Can you see the map? Do you see the questions on the right, or would you rather?
No, I can only see your printer.
Oh, beautiful. Okay, so we have a question from Nina, and she's asking about dehorning, if it's an effective conservation method, and if it's considered humane.
Yeah, good questions coming out here today. It is effective in that it disincentivizes poaching in the short term. But there's argument against that as well, because in some cases, poachers have been known to track a rhino to shoot it for poaching, obviously, and then they see it has no horn, so they kill it anyway so that they don't have to track it again. That's the first thing. The second thing that has been discovered in the Kruger National Park only about 2 years ago is that you cut a rhino's horn off, it regrows. And it grows very slowly. It'll only grow at about 2 inches a year. But that regrowth is twice as dense and twice as heavy as the original horn. And as a result, it's twice as valuable. So that incentivizes poachers immediately. The last one, is it ethical, is a question that I have fought with for a long time. Because the question remains, why does a rhinoceros have a horn? Of course, people talk about fighting each other, but that's not really the main reason. The main reason is that a rhinoceros needs to protect its young against predators. And, you know, a pride of lions, or even worse, and I've had losses in the Okavango to packs of hyenas. They'll go in and surround the mother and harass it until they get the baby. But in the case of a black rhino particularly, they'll fight those hyenas, and I've seen several dead hyenas that have been killed by the mother's horn, usually with a sideways swipe. So they have the horn to defend their babes. Now, removing the horn obviously removes that ability. But it has been shown that the mothers will still defend their young with the stub. Now, you can't saw a horn off right on the skull, because that's where the growth point is. So they're always left with about a 3 or 4 inch protrusion. And that is enough to kill a hyena, because a swing of a rhino's head will smash a hyena's ribs or break its back. So there actually have been a reduced or a very low number of baby rhinos lost. So the ethics are still in argument. The Botswana government has decided to dehorn under the current situation. I am supporting that in the absence of other major initiatives. So there you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have a few more. We have about 4 more questions, and please send more as you go along. So another question from Martha is, how is your organization tackling the cultural issue which continues to drive consumption of rhino tusk across Asia? What is the thinking around consumer behavior change on this front? And then there'll be a second question, which is a little linked. Does COVID have the potential to change the conversation around cultural preference for exotic game?
Okay, well, they are linked, these questions. The first thing I must point out is that Rhino Conservation Botswana is a organization dedicated to looking after animals in situ on the ground. We are not an international organization dealing with what we call demand. However, I'm the director of Rhino Conservation. In fact, I'm the founder. I started it. It didn't exist before I came with a vision and got some funding to start it. I communicate with organizations, Save the Rhino International and the Environmental Investigation Agency, who work overseas in China, Vietnam, etc., to carry out publicity campaigns, and work with the Chinese government to advertise on television and on radio. Radio is very powerful in China to try and reduce demand. The COVID question is still very open, because the suspicion is that this crisis was started in what is now described as a wet market. I would also call it a dry market, but they call them wet market. It is a market where wildlife products and derivatives are sold and taken away for cooking and consumption. There are also practitioners of Chinese and Eastern medicine in these wet markets. And if that's the case, and the Chinese have indicated that is the case, they are now clamping down on the wet markets. They are clamping down on the markets that sell wildlife products. However, we now know that rhino horn was not sold in the wet markets in a large degree. Some of the medical practitioners or the traditional medical practitioners in those wet markets would have had rhino horn in their pharmacopoeia, but they didn't have rhino horns in their possession. They got it from suppliers. What we have established now is that the criminal syndicates, the international criminal syndicates who are dealing in rhino horn are based in Vietnam. And these guys are running this as a business. They don't just deal in rhino horn, they're dealing in lion bones and pangolin scales and ivory and everything else. And when I say they run it as a business, they have active marketing campaigns and they stockpile and they control the price. Like right now under the COVID clampdowns, there's not much international transport. There's virtually zero aircraft flying and the reduced number of ships sailing. And so the amount of product leaving the African continent is very low. And we believe that the Vietnamese syndicates have ordered the chaps in Africa to stockpile in Africa until the world opens up again, if ever. You know, when I leave America in 2022. These syndicates control the market. And what they do is they use social media and media platforms to perpetuate rumor and fake news that rhino horn is good for gout or, you know, hangovers or cancer. And they put out reports that people have been cured. And they continue to market the product. And so the actual rhino horn is not sold openly in markets in China. It is sold via a network of salesmen that operate across the border between Vietnam and China and Laos and Vietnam and down into Taiwan and so on. So it is a much more sophisticated trade than merely a couple of markets in the cities of China. It's important to know that. But yes, to put it in a nutshell, I don't actively work in demand reduction. That is on a more international scale. I don't have that level of funding. You know, I've got a budget of probably $1.5 million a year. If you're going to be working overseas like that, that's the $10 million guys, you know, the guys with bigger budgets.
Okay, thank you. Next question, has the population decimation had a deleterious effect on rhino genetics?
Surprisingly not. Interestingly, the black rhino, who are in the smaller numbers right now, you know, there's only about 4,000 left, have a much broader DNA profile than that of the white rhino. The white rhino, as I said, have their background in just about 98 animals from 1910. But there's sufficient variability in their background, in their parentage, for them to be genetically viable. In fact, the white rhinoceros is surprisingly a fertile animal. You know, after a half-hour mating, we will probably have an 80% chance of a calf. That is a very, very high level of pregnancy achievement. So, no, the DNA base is actually quite broad because they originally were very wide. The black rhinoceros, if I can carry on, has been found to have a very wide variability. I have sourced black rhinoceros from Zimbabwe, and the DNA of those animals is the broadest of the lot because I can trace DNA there that comes from Zambia and even southern Tanzania that is in the Zimbabwe population. And those I've got from South Africa have a relatively narrow DNA of animals from KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. The Namibians, on the other hand, also have a very narrow DNA band. So, yeah, there's very little danger of inbreeding.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever worked with the Friedkin team out in Tanzania, Dan Friedkin, for the elephants and rhinos?
No. No,
Also,
I know of them, but I haven't worked with them. I haven't worked with anybody in East Africa. I've worked only in Southern Africa. We have a Southern Africa rhino group, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and Swaziland. These are the chaps I work with. I'm aware of the programs in Zambia, Tanzania, and of course Kenya. I'm aware of them, and Rwanda now. Rwanda has had translocation of animals from South Africa.
and then how much does a transmitter cost?
Well, the GPS one is about $2,500 now. But we also fit VHF ones, which are cheaper. I think they're about $550.
Okay.
But remember this, you know, that's I've just answered your question, but I'll flesh it out a little. When I'm going to fit a transmitter outside of the bomas, outside of the pens, in the wild, that is, I have to hire a helicopter, I have to hire a veterinarian, I have to pay for the drugs, you know, and so the entire operation, I haven't got my costings in front of me, but that'll be close to probably $8,000, including the price of the transmitter.
So as a result, Daryl has a follow-up question on that. Is there a danger of poachers hijacking the transmitter signals to locate rhinos?
They can in the case of the VHF, not the GPS. The GPS, I'm very fortunate, is encrypted, both ends. But the VHF one, you can buy a simple scanner in a sophisticated radio shop. So we actually switch the VHF transmitters off most of the time and switch them on when we're carrying out an operation and we've got aircraft in the air.
Great. Again, you feel free to unmute yourself if you want to talk directly. Map's around, you know, we also know it's 6:15, so feel free. I don't want to take all your time either, Matt, but if you're around, you know, definitely want to encourage more people to ask questions. I guess my last question is, if we donate to you now, what are the projects you're working on and how are you using the money?
Well, at the moment, because of the reduced funding, and most of my money is just used to keeping operations going. I need, you know, those guys you saw on the truck there and that pilot, these guys earn salaries. I got to pay these chaps. I got to give them food, diesel. So it's operations. I call it operational costs. We have been supporting the government in a dehorning operation over the last 3 weeks. But we don't put funding directly into that other than our guys supporting them. I won't be starting another project until this COVID is well settled. I've got to watch my funding. I need to look after my people first and keep the vehicles going. You know, just 2 weeks ago, we broke a gearbox. That will cost me probably 33,000 pula, which is $3,500. So, you know, these are costs that people don't see. But when you smash a gearbox or you break an engine, you know, one of those 4x4s, and the guys drive through water and suck water through, it costs a lot of money to run. So yeah, donations are very welcome just to keep our operations going. If I don't get significant funding, and that's why I'm in the States, if I don't get significant funding, I may have to reduce those teams in about 6 months' time. You know, put guys on furlough, for example. However, I'm very fortunate in that there are people who will understand that and send us sufficient funding to keep the teams in the field. So I would appreciate anything I can get. You know, a tank of gas is valuable to me, and a single meal for a patrolman or a uniform, you know, for the guys. So yeah, anything is gratefully accepted.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. You know, please email me, Elizabeth at EJ Africa, if you have more questions, and I put the link to the website and I will follow up with an email. But thank you all for coming today. You know, we're really, really appreciative of everyone who's donated so far and for all your support, because this is going to be hard on the ground, and we are very concerned. And we want to, you know, we're just thankful for people like you for having this wildlife that we get to appreciate, and we're very thankful, and we definitely want to support everything.
Well, once again, let me repeat. It is a total pleasure. It is it's not a job for me. It is my life. And I was very lucky to be born and raised there and get involved. But I do need help to do this work. And I thank every single person for just listening to me. By the way, the business of looking after wildlife and wildlife habitats and looking after our planet is the business of everybody. It's a conversation that needs to happen in our houses, in social gatherings. We're not allowed to do those anymore, are we? In our schools, but certainly within our families. I believe it is an international conversation that is as important as politics, as important as religion. It is very important. This is the planet that supports us. And I am extremely passionate about that subject, with a focus obviously on rhinos. And so any opportunity I have to speak to people, I like to be one-on-one if I can, but in these hard times, you, Elizabeth, and those of you who take the time and the effort to put me on Zoom or other means, it's very, very, very appreciated. And I thank you so much for that. And as I say, peace to everybody, and onwards.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Map.
Thank you.
Great pleasure, guys. Have a nice evening, and Mother's Day to those mothers.
Thank you for your time and info.
Okay, keep going, keep going.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna go.
Bye, Elizabeth.
Bye.
Bye all. Bye.